Take your hands off that van.
The tow truck already had its rear wheels off my driveway. Margaret Whitmore, our HOA president, barely looked at me. Too late. That eyesore is leaving. I stopped arguing. Because Margaret didn't know one thing. That van was federal property. Hours later, the tow yard learned exactly who owned it. Margaret ordered them to keep it anyway. That single email changed everything. But when investigators started pulling her HOA records, they discovered the van wasn't Margaret's biggest problem. It was just the first one they could prove. 6 days earlier, Margaret Whitmore walked onto my driveway and slapped a bright orange notice under the van's windshield wiper. $500. The violation described my gray Ford Transit as a commercial visual nuisance, inconsistent with neighborhood character. I looked from the paper to Margaret. The van is completely inside my driveway. I can see that. Then show me the rule I violated. She tapped her clipboard. The board has broad authority when something affects property values. Property values. Margaret's favorite phrase. For weeks, she had been talking about an upcoming neighborhood valuation review, telling residents we needed to present a premium image. I hadn't paid much attention. Now I noticed what she meant. Work vans, trailers, older pickups. Anything that looked like somebody actually worked for a living suddenly offended her definition of premium. "You have 48 hours," she said. I took out my phone. Photographed the violation. Photographed all 4 tires inside the driveway. Photographed the sidewalk. Then the property line. Margaret watched me like I was wasting my time. "You can document whatever you want." "I know." She smiled and walked away. What she didn't know was that documentation had been part of my job for most of my adult life. And when somebody hands you questionable paperwork, the smartest thing you can do is keep it. That $500 citation became page 1. My name is Daniel Mercer. I'm 57. Margaret had apparently decided I was just some contractor with an ugly truck. I didn't correct her. I spent 11 years working Army communications before moving into private security systems. Not armed security. I install and maintain the quiet infrastructure nobody notices until it stops working. Access control. Camera networks, encrypted communication links, remote monitoring systems. Government facilities were a regular part of my contract work. That taught me certain habits. Serial numbers get recorded. Equipment transfers get signed. Vehicles get inspected. If something changes custody, there is a name, a date, and a reason. My wife Claire used to laugh at me for it. She said I could turn ordering pizza into a chain of custody exercise. Claire died 4 years earlier, cancer. Afterward, I sold our larger house and moved closer to my daughter. I wanted quiet. A workshop, a small yard. No drama. The van sitting outside wasn't beautiful. The paint was scratched. One rear panel had a dent. There was an old ladder rack on top. Margaret saw something cheap. I saw a tool. And behind those scratched doors sat government-assigned technical equipment that was inventoried down to individual asset numbers. I wasn't allowed to be casual with that van. Margaret was about to be very casual with it. That evening, I emailed the HOA. No threats. I asked for 3 things. The exact rule I had violated, the section authorizing towing from a private driveway, and the appeal process for the $500 fine. Margaret responded 23 minutes later. 4 paragraphs. Not one actual bylaw citation. Instead, aesthetic compliance, neighborhood character, board discretion. Then she added a new penalty, $50 per day until the van disappeared. The next morning, every homeowner received an email titled, "Protecting Our Community Investment." My van was the photograph at the top. Margaret wrote that the neighborhood's upcoming valuation process required consistent visual standards. That was the first time I connected the pressure campaign to her valuation obsession. She wasn't just enforcing rules. She was curating an image. Tom, a neighbor from 2 streets over, caught me at the mailbox. She did that to a plumber last year. Did what? Put his work truck in the newsletter. What happened? He moved it. Tom hesitated. Then she did it to a guy with a utility trailer. That interested me. I went inside, printed Margaret's email, and highlighted one sentence. The board does not require individual homeowner consent to protect community appearance. I put it behind the citation. 2 pages. That was all I had. Then Thursday afternoon happened. I left for work at 7:30 in my personal pickup. The van stayed behind. At 3:18 p.m., my driveway camera sent a motion alert. I was inside a secure equipment room across town and didn't check it. When I turned onto my street that evening, the driveway looked wrong. Empty. I parked. Pulled out my phone. Opened the camera footage. At 3:21, a tow truck backed toward my house. At 3:23, Margaret's white SUV arrived. She stepped out carrying the same black clipboard. The driver stopped at the sidewalk. He appeared to ask her something. Margaret pointed toward the van, then at a document. She signed. The driver crossed onto my property, hooked the transit. At 3:31, the van left. Margaret stood beside my mailbox watching it disappear. I saved the footage locally, then to cloud storage, then onto an external drive. Only after that did I call the tow yard. North County Recovery. My name is Daniel Mercer. You removed a gray Ford Transit from my driveway today. The dispatcher asked for the plate, then the VIN. I read it from my custody records. Keys clicked. Then stopped. Mr. Mercer? Yes? There's something unusual attached to this VIN. What? I need my manager. That was when the tone of the entire situation changed. The manager's name was Evan Lawson. I heard office noise behind him as he took the call. He asked me to repeat the VIN. Then he asked me a question. Are you the registered owner? No. Who is? The federal government. Silence. Then his chair moved. I could hear him typing again. I explained the minimum. The van had been assigned to me under a government security support contract. I was the designated custodian. Inside were secured electronics racks, diagnostic hardware, and serialized equipment. Nothing I was going to describe further over an unsecured phone. But none of it belonged to the HOA. Evan asked for documentation. I opened the locked cabinet in my home office. Inside was the vehicle custody packet, asset identifier, VIN, condition sheet, agency property contact. I scanned the relevant pages and sent them. Then I called Marcus Hale, the property representative on my contract. You didn't authorize the vehicle movement? He asked. No. Police action? No. Repossession? No. Who ordered it? HOA president. Marcus paused. Did she know it was government property when they hooked it? No. Good to know. That question mattered, because at that moment, Margaret still had an explanation available to her. She could say she didn't know. She could release the van. She could apologize. Instead, inside the North County Recovery Office, Evan picked up his phone and called her. And Margaret decided to put the next mistake in writing. Evan called me back about 40 minutes later. We verified the vehicle paperwork. Okay. We were preparing to release it. Were. That word told me everything. What happened? The HOA president objected. I leaned against the kitchen counter. On what basis? She says you owe fines, tow charges, storage fees, and administrative fees. It's not my van. I explained that. What did she say? Evan let out a breath. She said the vehicle stays until you pay. At North County Recovery, this had stopped being routine. Evan later described what happened. He was standing near the service counter with my vehicle documentation open on a monitor. The gray Transit was visible through the yard window. Margaret called. He told her ownership had been verified. He told her a government property representative had contacted the company. Then he asked her a simple question. Mrs. Whitmore, are you still instructing us not to release this vehicle? Yes. Can you send that instruction by email? She did. 5 minutes later, it reached my inbox. Do not release the vehicle until Mr. Mercer satisfies all HOA fines, towing costs, storage fees, and administrative charges. And then one more sentence. I do not care who he claims owns it. I forwarded the message to Marcus. He called immediately. Do not fight with her. I won't. Do not threaten anybody. I won't. Save everything. I looked at my growing folder. That part I already understand. Margaret had been given a clean exit. Instead, she had created a written record showing she chose control after ownership became disputed. That email became the center of the story. But it still wasn't the worst document she had created. The next morning, Margaret called me. Daniel, I understand you're trying to frighten our towing contractor. I sent them proof of ownership. You sent them paperwork. Yes. She laughed softly. You contractors love paperwork. I almost smiled. Margaret, the ownership issue has been resolved. Tell them to release the vehicle. You have unpaid violations. The vehicle doesn't belong to me. Then perhaps whoever owns it should reconsider allowing you to park it here. There was something revealing about the way she said that. The government itself had somehow become another homeowner she intended to discipline. I wrote down the time. 9:12 a.m. Margaret, I'm asking one more time. Release the van. No. Then she said it. Federal, state, local, I don't care. Your driveway is inside my HOA. I stopped writing. Not because I was surprised. Because it was the cleanest summary of Margaret's worldview I had ever heard. In her mind, jurisdiction was whatever space she happened to be standing in. I understand, I said. You understand what? That you're refusing. She sounded confused by my calm, then annoyed. Pay what you owe. I ended the call. No argument. No threat. Marcus coordinated the property loss report with the agency security office. The tow yard was instructed to preserve records associated with custody and access. At that point, everything could still have remained an ugly administrative dispute. Then one employee opened the rear doors. The van wasn't a Hollywood spy vehicle. No secret weapons. No glowing screens. Mostly cases, cables, tools, and secured electronics. But equipment doesn't need to look dramatic to have strict custody rules. One internal cabinet had a numbered tamper seal. When North County Recovery photographed the van at intake, that seal was intact. Later, during an unauthorized inventory attempt, it wasn't. The employee who opened the cabinet apparently thought he was looking for registration information. The moment Evan realized what had happened, he stopped the process. The transit was moved inside. Access was restricted. The yard preserved its camera footage. The agency security office requested a full equipment check. Nobody immediately claimed anything had been stolen. That wasn't the point. The custody chain had been broken. Now every serialized item had to be verified. Every person near that cabinet had to be identified. Every access event had to be documented. Evan called me that afternoon. "We're preserving everything." "Good. Calls too." "Good." He lowered his voice. "Your HOA president keeps calling. What does she want?" "She wants us to stop discussing the vehicle with you." I looked at the paperwork on my desk. "She knows you can't do that, right?" "She knows now." Then Evan said something else. "When we started pulling everything tied to the HOA account, we noticed your tow authorization didn't look like some of the others." "What do you mean?" "There are signatures that don't match the approval notes." That was the first crack in a much larger wall. Tom came to my house that evening carrying 2 old towing notices. The next day, Rachel Kim called. Rachel had served as HOA secretary before Margaret forced her off the board after a series of disagreements. "I heard North County is reviewing old authorizations." "So did I. I think you need to see something." Rachel brought a box of meeting packets she had legally retained from her time as secretary. Minutes, agenda sheets, board approvals, towing requests. We spread them across my dining table. At first, nothing jumped out. Then Rachel showed me 3 documents covering the same month. A meeting agenda said vehicle enforcement had been deferred pending legal review. The final minutes said the board approved enhanced towing enforcement. Then there was a tow authorization signed by Margaret 2 days later. Rachel stared at it. That vote never happened. We kept looking. More authorizations. More discrepancies. At least 19 towing actions appeared to have been initiated under something Margaret called President's Emergency Appearance Authority. Rachel had never heard of it. Neither had the bylaws. In several cases, later board minutes described the actions as if the board had authorized them. That was bigger than aggressive towing. Margaret wasn't merely enforcing rules too harshly. She appeared to be using the board's name to create authority the board had never actually granted her. And now her motive made sense. The neighborhood valuation review, marketing photographs, refinancing shared facilities. She wanted work vans, utility trailers, and older vehicles gone before outsiders looked at the community. Image first, procedure second, authority whenever convenient. My van had not created Margaret's system. It had simply been the first tow involving property whose owner had an outside compliance structure powerful enough to demand clean documentation. Rachel looked at me. "She's holding an emergency meeting Tuesday." "For what?" "To celebrate the towing crackdown." I looked at the 19 files. Of course she was. By Monday, my dining room had become a document station. I built one timeline. No speculation. No dramatic language. Only facts. The $500 citation. Margaret's community email. The daily fines. Driveway footage. 2 authorization. Federal custody documents. North County's release verification. Margaret's written hold order. My contemporaneous notes from the call. Broken seal report. Then a separate section labeled prior HOA enforcement records provided by former secretary. I kept them separate because they weren't my allegations to make. That mattered. Marcus called Monday afternoon. The local investigator handling the custody access issue may attend tomorrow. Why the meeting? To clarify who issued the hold and preserve direct statements if the board discusses it publicly. Understood. Let them ask the federal questions. I plan to. I closed the binder. Margaret believed power meant controlling the conversation. I had learned the opposite. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is create a record and then stop talking. Tuesday evening, I entered the clubhouse. A projector screen behind Margaret read, "Restoring Community Standards." Underneath was a photograph of my van being towed. She had turned the evidence into a victory slide. Perfect. Margaret thanked the board for refusing to be intimidated by non-compliant residents. I sat near the back. She spoke about discipline, visual standards, protecting investments. Then the slide changed. My empty driveway. A few residents clapped. Most didn't. The board recently demonstrated, Margaret said, that nobody is above community rules, regardless of profession or claimed outside connections. Claimed. She still thought I was bluffing. Board member Alan Price raised his hand. Margaret, was ownership of that van verified? The vehicle was in violation. That isn't what I asked. Margaret's smile tightened. Ownership does not determine aesthetic compliance. Alan leaned forward. Did Daniel own it? No. A murmur moved across the room. Then why did we hold somebody else's property for Daniel's fine? Margaret closed her folder harder than necessary. If we allow technicalities to override enforcement, the board becomes powerless. Technicalities. That word landed even worse than claimed. She kept going. In fact, I am proposing tonight that the president receive expanded towing authority so we never face this type of obstruction again. Rachel looked at me. I looked toward the doors. They opened. Evan Lawson entered first. Behind him was a local investigator, then Marcus Hale, accompanied by an agency security representative. No sirens, no dramatic entrance, just 4 people carrying documents. The room went silent anyway. The agency representative introduced himself and placed a vehicle record on the board table. Mrs. Whitmore, I need to establish one fact concerning the transit removed from Mr. Mercer's residence. Margaret straightened. Our attorney handles legal questions. You are free to contact counsel. He glanced at the record. Did you instruct North County Recovery to continue holding this vehicle after being informed that it was United States government property? Margaret immediately looked at Evan. The towing company made its own decisions. Evan said nothing. The investigator opened a folder. Mr. Lawson preserved the communications. Then he read, "Do not release the vehicle until Mr. Mercer satisfies all HOA fines, towing costs, storage fees, and administrative charges." He looked at Margaret. "Did you send this?" She didn't answer. He continued, "I do not care who he claims owns it." Someone behind me whispered, "Oh my God." Margaret finally spoke. "I was enforcing our governing documents." The agency representative answered calmly, "Your governing documents do not establish ownership of federal property." That was it. No shouting, no humiliation speech, just one sentence separating her clipboard from actual jurisdiction. Margaret switched tactics. This is one towing dispute. It has nothing to do with association governance. Rachel stood. She carried the old meeting packets. I think governance is exactly the issue. Margaret stared at her. Rachel placed the deferred enforcement agenda on the table. Then the later minutes claiming approval. Then 3 towing authorizations. I was secretary when these votes supposedly happened. She looked around the room. They didn't. The silence changed. Before, people had been watching Margaret defend herself. Now they were looking at one another, because suddenly every old fine and every tow had a new question attached to it. Was it actually approved, or had Margaret simply said it was? Rachel placed the remaining files down. 19 that I found. Margaret had spent years using paperwork to make people feel powerless. Now the paperwork belonged to everybody in the room. Margaret was not dragged out in handcuffs. The consequences were more ordinary and more permanent. That night, the board voted to suspend her enforcement authority. Within 48 hours, Association Council recommended freezing all disputed towing fines and preserving records. North County terminated the HOA towing arrangement pending review. The board brought in outside management to compare actual votes against enforcement actions. Several towing orders lacked documented authorization. Some meeting minutes did not match Rachel's retained agenda packets and contemporaneous notes. Homeowners who had quietly paid fines began requesting records. The plumber on Cedar Lane came back. The retired electrician challenged his trailer tow. A landscaper brought 3 notices. Meeting attendance jumped from 12 people to more than 70. Margaret resigned before the review was completed. But the moment I remember happened at the next meeting. For years, she had stood behind the center podium with her black clipboard. That night, someone else chaired the meeting. Margaret sat in the last row. No nameplate. No microphone. No clipboard. Just another homeowner waiting for public comment. One by one, the new board voted to void or reopen improperly authorized enforcement actions. Every vote appeared on the screen behind them. Reversed. Under review. Refund approved. Margaret stared at the floor. Nobody mocked her. They didn't need to. The position she had used to make people feel small had vanished. And for the first time, the HOA looked less like Margaret's organization and more like a group of homeowners again. 3 weeks later, another tow truck turned onto my street. This time, it was bringing something back. The gray Transit rolled off the carrier and settled onto the same driveway where Margaret had ordered it removed. Evan stepped out. Never thought I'd be happy to deliver this thing. I walked around the van, checked the exterior, opened the rear doors, reviewed the equipment inventory, verified the replacement tamper seal. Everything that needed to be accounted for was accounted for. Tom watched from across the street. Rachel had stopped during her evening walk. Alan from the board stood near the sidewalk. Nobody had planned a gathering. People were simply curious to see the van that had started all of it. I shut the rear doors. Tom looked at the scratched paint. "You know, Daniel." "What?" "It doesn't look so ugly anymore." That got a laugh. The new HOA policy went into effect the following month. Written authority for towing. Documented notice. Real appeal rights. Board approval except for actual emergencies. Published minutes. Conflict disclosures. No invented presidential powers. No enforcement by personal preference. Work vans still weren't beautiful. They just stopped being treated like moral failures. I never ran for the board. I didn't want Margaret's seat. Replacing one person's control with another person's control would have missed the point. I agreed to help organize the association's records for a few months. That was enough. Margaret had believed authority came from the person holding the clipboard. My career taught me differently. Real authority has a boundary. It has a source. It has a record. And sooner or later, somebody asks to see it. That evening, I parked the van, locked it, and went into the garage. Above my workbench was a small metal sign Claire had bought me years ago as a joke. I had almost forgotten it was there. 2 words: document everything. Turns out she was right.